You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to The New Stack Makers. I'm Charles Humble, an author here at The New Stack, and for this episode I'm joined by Sarah Wells. She is a technology leader, consultant, and conference speaker with a focus on microservices, engineering enablement, observability, and DevOps. She has over 20 years of experience as a developer, principal engineer, and tech director across product, platform, SRE, and DevOps teams. And she spent over a decade working at the Financial Times as the firm transitioned from 12 releases a year to more than 20,000, adopting public cloud, microservices, and DevOps. Sarah has written up her experiences in a brand new book from O'Reilly called Enabling Microservices Success. This is my copy. It's a fantastic book, and one which I think sort of joins Sam Newman's Building Microservices as one of the absolutely essential books on this topic. If Sam Newman focuses primarily on the process of architecting and building microservices in the first place, then Sarah focuses on what it takes to keep what is now effectively a legacy system built out of microservices running. So in other words, if you have a long-running microservices system, you absolutely need to read this book. I'll say, too, that I think for any sort of progressive company thinking about how do we do this better, it's just packed with really brilliant practical advice. And I'm thrilled to have the privilege to interview Sarah for The New Stack. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. What a fantastic intro. Thank you.
That's all right. So something I've written about fairly extensively, and which you also talk about in the book, is that in essence, a transformation like the one the Financial Times went on is both an organizational transformation and a technological one. So I thought for this podcast, we'd do it in roughly two halves and talk first about some of those organizational aspects and then dive more into the tech side of things in the sort of second half. So with that in mind, can you talk about the way the FT evolved as an organization? I know when you joined in 2011, you had two separate technology organizations, for example. So how did that change and what did it look like?
So, we had two technology organizations, and that was because that there were parts of the business that felt that things were moving too slowly. So they went and effectively hired a separate organization. Shortly after I joined, that got regularized into one department. But there was that sense that the business wanted to do things and technology were slow moving and not able to deliver things quickly enough. And that is a big issue. And if you can't release features quickly, you can't possibly experiment with them. You can't try things out and see whether they have an impact. So I think we realized that the technology leadership realized that there was an issue there. Really needed to think about how we could make changes more quickly, be able to try something out and not go ahead with it. You can't do that if you're only releasing code once a month. You have too much change involved in that to know what's had an impact, and you've got too much built on top of it to easily unpick it. So one of the first things that the FT did, and I think this is the way people quite often start this sort of change, was to look at something fairly technical, which was, could we make it much quicker to set up and provision a server? So when I joined the FT, it took, I think, around 6 months to get the production server that we were going to put the content API that I was working on onto. But there was a lot of investment in infrastructure as code, in our own private cloud. And within about 3 years, that had come down to 15 minutes. Shortly after that, 15 minutes seemed like a long time to wait to provision a server. But that kind of investment in automation and self-service, so I as an engineer could go and spin up a new server, really, it unlocks the next step of that change, which is to start looking at how can you release changes more frequently. So that is when you start to really look at continuous delivery and automating your build and deployment pipelines. And once you've started to do that, you start to realize that your teams need to be the ones releasing changes,
Right.
Which is where DevOps really came in as an idea, is that if you want to be able to quickly benefit from a feature, you can't have a separate dev team and an ops team, and the need to throw it over the wall to ops to release and manage.
Right, yes. And as part of that, you're also, I think, you need your developers to be able to operate autonomously, effectively. So you have to sort of remove some of the levels of control that we traditionally had in IT. And I think there's this really interesting thing that happens, and it's particularly in larger organizations like the FT, which is you have to try and find some kind of level of balance between giving people complete autonomy to do whatever they like and having some level of control and standardization. So you end up with things that, people can move between teams and stuff can be maintained. So again, just thinking about it from an organizational point of view, how did you approach that at the Financial Times?
Well, I think we kind of swung a bit like a pendulum. So we started off when I joined, it was a fairly defined and small set of technologies. So everything was written in Java and deployed onto Tomcat and used the same database. And that was, as we started to give teams autonomy and allowed them, created cross-functional teams and created a cloud and the ability to spin up your own resources, we moved to the other end of the pendulum where people could do pretty much what they wanted. And that sped up those teams. You're not having to wait for someone to decide this is the graph database that we're going to use. You can actually choose the right thing for your needs. So there was a need for having a graph database, for having document stores, for things that represented your data in a different way, because you can much more easily create features when you have the right structured database sat underneath it. But we did get to that point where you realize that there's 8 of everything. And it is very difficult to make sure that that's secure, to keep a control of costs, to even know what you've got running in your software estate when everyone has that freedom. And I think you have to really focus on what's the important part of autonomy. And it's autonomy for teams to target a particular outcome in the best way possible. Mm-hmm. So autonomous teams, it's not anarchy. You're not going to have a content API team deciding to rebuild the FT's website, but they're going to have a view of how can they best provide a content API that serves their customers' needs. And that might be, well, I actually, for the business purpose, I need to have this different way of doing things. So you try and restrict autonomy in areas that are kind of boring standard technology, things like build and deployment pipelines. It's very unlikely that you need teams to be autonomous in the way they solve that problem.
Right.
And I think, and I'm not saying that didn't happen. I definitely had, there were teams at the FT who decided they wanted to build their own approach to doing continuous delivery. And there's always space for, this might be a much better solution. It might solve a problem better for everybody, but you have to try and avoid having 3 different ways of deploying to production.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I think Netflix talks a lot about the sort of responsibility aspect of autonomy. You can do whatever you like, but that comes with expectations about how you behave, which is a sort of another balancing factor. A related question I had was, I know you didn't use code freezes, and I think, again, you and I have both had that experience with code freezes where what happens is, you freeze code deploys for a while, and then you end up with this huge backlog of changes, and you have to release that all in one go, and it ends up being a bit of a nightmare. So obviously we don't want to do that. But the Financial Times is a newspaper, and so there are various points where, to be frank, bringing down the website would be particularly bad.
Yes.
Right now, as we're recording this, we're both in the UK, there's an election going on, right? No one wants their news website down the day of the election or the day afterwards, because that would be really bad news. So how do you, again, coming back to this autonomy thing, how do you balance that?
So one of the roles that I had at the FT was heading up operations reliability. I was tech director of operations reliability. So I would make sure people knew what was going on, because you can't assume that everyone knows that it's budget day or that there's a US election, because just you're a software developer at the FT. It's not necessarily the case that you are interested in the news or follow it. So you basically make sure you say, this is a big news day. Think carefully about what you released today. And I think developers are very good at evaluating the risk of the changes they're making. They know if the change is really trivial and it's unlikely to cause problems. And they know where it's something bigger, where, for example, you're transforming data or you're completely changing the way something works. You might hold off on that. So I think the message is generally, it's not a code freeze, but just be aware that that this will be embarrassing. To break
Right.
the website today would be bad. So think about it.
Yes. Yes. I think there's another interesting aspect of this, which is from a team structure point of view, I presume you ended up with sort of small autonomous teams, effectively. It's sort of generally how this is done, which is great. But I think you can end up with a situation, the handoffs between teams or communications between teams. Obviously, you try and optimize so you have less of that, but you will still have some of that. And I think that area is particularly tricky, and it can be particularly tricky because I think sometimes we lose our empathy or perspective for what the other teams are working on when we're kind of focused on our own little individual group. I had a really interesting conversation with Elizabeth Hendrickson on a podcast recently, and she talked about how Pivotal Labs, where she worked for a while, they had this really strong culture of doing team rotation. So you would sort of move around with different teams. And she said that was a really effective way of kind of creating empathy, which I thought was really interesting. And in your book, you talk about secondment for collaboration and autonomy. But I wondered obviously that's an effective mechanism for collaboration. But is it an effective mechanism for empathy as well?
I think it is. So throughout my time at the FT, we had people that would go and work on other teams. It was part of a new starter policy, which you should go and spend a week with 3 different teams. So you got to know other people and you got to know other parts of the estate. A week's quite a short period of time. You get to know people, you get some overview of what's going on, particularly if teams have very different technology. It's hard to really feel like you're making a contribution in that. When I was setting up the operations and reliability team, we were trying to, we didn't think we had enough people to really do what we wanted to do. And we were having a conversation about, can we get people from other groups within the FT? But it's really hard to get people to transfer permanently members of staff within their group. So we came up with the idea of running secondments for 3 months at a time. So we would get 2 people from another group that would come and sit with us and work with us for 3 months. And this was actually, it was great. It was more than just what they contributed to the team. It was the fact that those people really understood what we were trying to do and the tooling that we were building. And so they would be good advocates for us. They would go back. They were our contacts in those teams. And so it really helped us to spread the word of what we were doing and to basically show to other people why it was a positive thing.
Right. Yes.
And I think it's great. It's great for the people that come on secondment as well. You get exposure to different ways of working, different technologies. Particularly, quite often it was junior people who maybe joined the FT as their first job in software. So actually, it was an opportunity to see a different way of working within the same organization, and to bring back some of those ideas as well, and to share what they were doing in their team. So it was a really effective knowledge transfer mechanism.
Yes, I really like that as well, because I think so much of development, particularly when you're first starting out as a software developer, so much of it is really it's sort of like apprenticeship. I think you learn from seeing what other people are doing, and the more senior people on the team, what they're doing, and so moving around, I think, is a really, really effective way of encouraging getting more of that, getting more exposure to new ideas, and it can be quite stimulating as well. So changing gears a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the sort of technology end of the FT? So what does it look like from a financial point of view? You've said already it was taking you quite a while to add servers. Maybe talk a little bit about how deployments were done and whether those involved outages and those sort of things.
So when I first joined the FT in 2011, we were operating in our own data centers. We had a system built on a SQL database where you had to do schema changes as part of a release, which took time. And as a result, we couldn't do 0 downtime deployments. So we would do deployments on Saturday. We would find a Saturday in a month that wasn't expected to have a lot of business or or political news, because that's the main focus for the FT. And we would book a slot. We would freeze the website, so all the stories were still readable, but you couldn't publish new stories. So we'd have to hope that there was no big story about to break. And it would take hours. And if it went wrong, it would take hours to roll that back too, which it's just a really laborious process involving a lot of people. It was very manual. The steps were in an Excel spreadsheet, be about 40 lines of steps that someone was manually doing to release it. Generally, at least one of those would not be quite right, but the people had the experience to understand this is incorrect. It was just error prone and manual. And so we really wanted to automate that. We wanted to make it so that that you didn't have to go through a very slow process. We wanted to move to technology stacks that allowed you to do small changes in some part of the system, and we adopted microservices. It's actually 3 different projects happened around the same time at the FT, and all 3 groups independently decided to adopt a microservice architecture. And I don't know that I would recommend that, because you're learning a lot when you're doing it, but actually worked out that all 3 were successful in the project they were doing, adopting this new way of doing things. And it was possible because of the investment in infrastructure as code and automation that had already happened. And the database choices that we made were, they were NoSQL databases. They didn't have all of our data in, so it was much easier to do a change without having to shut down the system as a whole. And then once you can do changes at any time, you start doing that. You have very small changes that are going live all the time, and the development team are making the decision of whether this is a good time to go live with it. And it lets you build features more gradually and get feedback more quickly.
Right. Yeah. So just to unpick that a little bit more, I'm really interested in that sort of starting point. So basically, how do you go from deploying a few times a year, 4 or 6 or 12 times a year, to deploy whenever you need to? What's the first key thing you have to get in place to make that happen?
You need automated deployment. You need continuous delivery. So you need automated build and deployment pipelines, automated testing in those pipelines so that it's a quick and repeatable process to make a change. You also need to change the culture around what it means to release to production. And that can be difficult, because there are people whose responsibilities are about making sure we have a successful release to production. And the tasks currently are manual and process based around, there's a change advisory board. So when I first joined the FT, you went to the change advisory board to talk about the changes you were planning to make. And you discussed them, and people said, that sounds fine, it's not going to clash with this other change. And change advisory boards feel like they add to your ability to successfully release quality releases. Research suggests that they don't. Because the people in that room don't have the context the way that the teams do. And if you build a loosely coupled architecture, probably those teams can make changes without impacting other parts of the system. But there are people who are invested in that, and that's what their job involves. And you have to convince them that actually there are better ways for them to ensure quality releases to production. And they'll be able to spend their time on more interesting things than running a 3-hour meeting that's got 20 people in it, or a 1-hour meeting, I think probably at the FT. And so it's that kind of change. And the thing that kicked it off, really, I think at the FT, was having a separate company that managed the FT's mobile apps. And they were able to make changes more quickly. And people would say, why can they do changes? Why can they build a feature more quickly than the website? And part of the answer was because they don't have to go through this process that's been defined for releasing code to production. And when you can see that the stakeholders are okay with this process, so code goes out, and if anything's wrong, someone says there's a problem and it gets fixed really quickly, you can start to convince people that actually that's okay generally.
Yeah. Again, it's really interesting that, because we have very similar experience of working in organizations with these, quite often quite bureaucratic processes where forms had to be signed and things had to be ticked in order to do a release. And getting rid of that is scary. And I think also for individuals that, because some of those are quite senior, like if it's an architecture review board or something like that, then some of those are quite senior people. They've been around, they've seen a lot, they've got to this point where they have this job which sort of feels maybe quite safe and secure, and suddenly you're coming along and going, actually, we don't need any of that. And I think that, the sort of human aspect of that, I think is quite interesting and quite tricky.
Yeah, I think you have to have conversations about your expertise is better used in enabling everybody else to do things right, in saying this is what it means to build a secure and safe and reliable architectural system than it is in having in defining what the architecture is for everybody.
Yeah.
I think it's that idea that the tasks you do now are not the responsibilities you have, and those tasks could change. You should be open to the idea that the task is different, but the responsibility is still there.
Yes. Yeah. So you talked a bit about you had 2 or 3 separate projects effectively running that was the beginning of adopting microservices. So was that kind of how the decision to adopt microservices was arrived at, that some people just went off and did it and it seemed to work?
I'm going to say yes. It certainly was. So I'm assuming. So I was at the point this was happening, I was a senior engineer and tech lead running a team. So I wasn't really involved in those conversations, but I think it was an architectural proposal. We're going to try doing this as microservices because we are convinced that small changes will basically make it easier for us to make progress. If you have a small change, you can understand it, you can test it fairly easily, and you can check in production whether it's having the impact that you expect. And I think that once you've accepted that small changes are actually less likely to fail than big changes, you want a loosely coupled architecture, and microservices is a good way to do that.
Yeah. So was that effectively like a complete rewrite? Did you more or less?
Yeah. Yeah, it was 3 big rewrites happening pretty much. And I don't know if I would necessarily recommend that either, but actually, so my real experience would be with the content API there. And I worked on the first content API at the FT, and I worked on the rewrite. It was a rewrite rather than a gradual migration, but it was a rewrite by lots of people who'd been part of the original, writing the original system. So in fact, we all had that domain knowledge. Right. We understood the decisions that had been made in the past. And so we were effectively rewriting something that we really understood very well. And I think that was quite powerful, because we could basically say, yeah, okay, we know what we want. We know how we would have built it if we were redesigning it. And that's what we did. It does mean that you have a system that's live for a while that doesn't get a lot of changes happening in it while you rebuild. So that's probably why I wouldn't do a full rewrite generally. Because it stops you doing new features, because you don't mostly want to write new things in the old system while you're also focused on creating the new system.
Yeah. I mean, I've only done one complete rewrite of a thing, and it was absolutely a hell. But I think part of the reason it was so hellish was because as you were talking, I was just thinking about it. We knew the domain in the sort of business sense, but we didn't really understand all the ins and outs of the software, because the reason we were rewriting it was because it was so old.
Yeah.
And then there were always sort of weird edge cases that emerged. It was like a investment banking back-end HR type system. And there were always sort of bizarre edge cases that emerged as we were like rolling it out and trying it out with users, where they suddenly go, oh, we need to be able to do this X thing. It's like, there's no way you can do that with the old system. Oh, yes, there is. Look, we just, we press this button and throw some salt over our shoulder and do this other thing, and then it all happens. Oh, okay. I had no idea that behavior was even there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was just endless. I mean, it was literally about a year, 18 months, I think, of just going through and finding all these bizarre edge cases that none of us had any idea about. So it's interesting. It's interesting to me that you had a successful rewrite, because my one and only experience is like, I'm never doing that again, ever.
I mean, I think that most rewrites are a real challenge, particularly if you're rewriting a system that doesn't have any tests and doesn't have the documentation, and you don't have experience with it. I think we were lucky there. Generally, I think if you can do that strangler fig approach of extracting parts of the monolith and rewriting that part as a service. That's probably a safer way. And it certainly means that you are able to start providing new value alongside the old system as you're going.
Yeah. You were quite early adopters of public cloud as well, specifically AWS, I think. So what was that like? I presume at the beginning people would have had concerns around, what does it even mean to run code on other people's machines, and what happens if they put the price up and all of that stuff. So what was that like?
Well, so I can remember like architectural teams talking about, well, why would you run your code on someone else's servers? But from the point of view of a senior developer, which I was at the time, what actually happened was that the FT created their own cloud that effectively virtualized parts of their data centers. And then at some point, when there was a lot of evidence of people being very successful in using AWS for building systems, they started having AWS as an option behind their cloud instead of servers in the data center. So it didn't feel like a big migration at that point. Mm-hmm. In fact, it hid quite a lot of AWS functionality, and that turned out to be a bit of a problem, because if you want to really benefit from something like AWS, you probably need to use all of the custom stuff that's available. That's where you get the value. But it didn't feel like a massive migration because we already had this FT cloud that you were interacting with.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because it's a conversation. Major Speakers is a conversation I've just had with a couple of different clients where they are worrying about getting locked into one particular cloud provider, and I keep saying to them, I think you're worrying about the wrong things. Actually, how likely is it you're going to move from? You might move some workloads, but how likely is it you're going to move lock, stock, and barrels from AWS to Azure or AWS to GCP or whatever it is? But conversely, by worrying about that, you're not getting the best out of the cloud provider that you're using because you're worried about using some of its very specific services. Again, I think it's kind of an interesting trade-off there.
Yeah, I think that you shouldn't be treating the cloud as just a thing you run your services on. That whole lift and shift, I am going to basically spin up some servers and install this database and operate it myself. You're not getting the benefit. And also it's the thing where you're just it slows you down and you don't get to use the value add. And this applies to anything where you're saying, I want to be able to have two different CDNs. I want to have two different databases. Back in the day, I can remember trying to build a system where we were asked not to use any of the custom features of Oracle. Well, that feels bad because they're the bits that add value for you, and it makes it much harder. You have to test it on multiple different databases. So I think you probably need to choose a vendor that has stability and that you're fairly convinced is going to be around for the long term, and build things using the things that they provide. And if they put the price up massively, yeah, you might have to do a migration, but you'll have to balance the cost of the migration against the increased cost.
Right. Yes. Yeah. There's something I wanted to pick up on to do with microservices. I think a lot of the times getting the service boundaries right in the first place is really difficult. But I also think there's a really interesting secondary thing, which, to be honest, I hadn't really thought about until reading the book, which is that the boundaries can change. So you finally get them right, and sometimes that, unless you know the domain really well, sometimes that might take more than one attempt, should we say. But then you have to keep in mind that can shift and change under you. And I was just again curious about your experience of that, because it's something I've not really seen talked about elsewhere.
I think you should never assume that things are set in stone. And it might be that you get the boundary right for the work that you're doing, and then you start doing something different, and you find that now two of the services are changing all the time at the same time. And I think you should be prepared with a microservice architecture to listen to what your experience is telling you, which is these maybe need to be merged together. If you're having a lot of problems, so the examples often are, I have to change both these services. every time I'm making a change at the moment, maybe you should combine them. If you start to have to find it difficult, because you're starting to think about data in multiple places and how do you make sure it's consistent, maybe you've split something that should be actually part of the same service, because you shouldn't have to manage distributed transactions if you can avoid it. And I think often early days of microservices, people went for far too many microservices, and certainly at the FT we had a lot. And sometimes it would have been easier to combine some of those services and not have to worry about data across them.
Yes. Yeah. That makes sense. One of your roles at the FT was around what you called engineering enablement, which is sometimes called platform teams. Actually, that's interesting in itself to me. So why do you prefer the term engineering enablement platform team?
So this is something that Sam Newman wrote a blog post about, and it really encapsulated what I was already thinking, which is if you have a platform team, they think their role is to build a platform. And the role isn't to build a platform. The role is to enable other engineering teams. And maybe that isn't around building a platform. Maybe you build a selection of services, or as a minimum, maybe you document which AWS services a team should be using. What you're there for is to speed up other teams by removing some of their cognitive load, by introducing services that are well documented that they can use, that give them some consistency. And then there's a secondary role, I think, which is to make sure the organization has quality, security, cost control measures included that it cares about, but that each individual team may have a pressure to be delivering features. So you're there to make sure it's easy for all of those teams that are focused on features to do things the right way.
Yes. Yeah. It's a really good example, actually, of how important getting names right is, which is something that I get more and more obsessed about. I've seen it at an API level as well, where just like giving something the right name makes it so much easier for people to understand what it is, and so really reduces the amount of documentation you need to write or the amount of support calls you get or whatever, because you spent the time working on the language bit in the first place.
Yeah.
Can you describe a bit about what the engineering enablement team looked like at the FT while you were responsible for it?
Yeah, so we had within engineering enablement, we did actually have our first line operational support, because part of enabling other teams is to make sure that they are only involved in incidents that actually affect them. We also had teams that built cloud tooling, did cloud enablement. So that would involve providing a thin wrapper around AWS that was our provider, providing templates, for example, about how to do serverless tasks. So there were some templates you could use to say, I want to read something off a queue and stick it into S3. Well, that makes it easy for any team that needs to do this. There's a lot of value in having repeatable templates to follow. We had teams that managed monitoring and alerting tooling. They dealt with the edge, so things like CDN, DNS. So a lot of it's around vendor engineering. You've got some vendor and you want to make sure that people internally can easily use their tools and understand what it's providing them and how to interact with it. And then we had some teams focused on visualization. So can we show teams how they're doing in terms of how good their alerts are, how good their runbooks are? We had a security engineering team. They spent a lot of time making sure they could show people where they should focus their efforts to improve the security of their systems. What's the biggest effect you can have? If you fix this, this would be the best thing. Because every team's got loads of stuff to do, but what you want to do is say to them, here's what is the most value for you right now.
Right. Yes. Yeah. There's a sort of interesting thing which we haven't really talked about, but you had a lot of different ways of doing things at the FT, right? So you had Kubernetes and containers. You had some people working with Heroku. You had AWS and Lambda. So we sort of have this idea of a golden path or a paved road, but when you've got that many different ways of working, how does that end up? Do you pick like one paved road, or do you have multiple different paved roads? What does that look like?
So I think if you were setting out to define a paved road, you probably would pick one way of hosting and deploying things. But the FT had already gone for sort of fairly widespread autonomy. The aim was to say you can have multiple paved roads, but that central engineering enablement team was focused on some of them in particular. And where teams had gone and made their own choices about how to do something, they had a responsibility to manage that themselves and to comply with the organization's guardrails. And what we try and do was build composable tools and services that people could make use of in their platforms. So, for example, everyone could call the Change API to log changes they were releasing to production, regardless of how they were doing that, because that was something we valued centrally, and it was relatively simple for people to integrate with that. But yeah, the team that was running a container approach to deployment, they managed that themselves. What they actually did in the end was move to EKS, which is Amazon's managed Kubernetes, because you don't really want to spend a lot of your time in doing that management if you can get someone else to do it for you.
Yeah. Is that still the case? Did you eventually did that level of different ways of doing things, did that sort of eventually become a bit of a friction point? And did you standardize anything further, or?
So at the time I left, which was at the end of 21, we still had multiple different ways of doing things, but teams that worked in the same tech stack had converged a bit more. So, for example, if you were writing Node apps and deploying them to Heroku, there was a lot more commonality between how to do that than there had been at some points. And at one point at the FT, we had two completely different Kubernetes clusters written by two different teams, and that had been merged to have one approach that had then moved to EKS. So we had done some sort of sensible merging, but there's always going to be a question, which is if you have a large number of teams that are deploying Node apps to Heroku and a large number that are deploying Go apps to Kubernetes, it's not in any of those teams' interest to change stack. So it's very hard to say you're going to stop delivering features to your stakeholders while you make a very big change in how you do things. And I couldn't really think about how I would persuade people to do that. So my focus when I was at the FT was, what can we do that makes it that builds a common foundation that teams can make use of, that means they don't have to have as many people focused on the basic platform thing in their area.
Right. Yes. What's next for you? What are you doing? What are you doing now? You've finished the book, so what's next?
I'm doing some consultancy. Yeah, I'm basically really interested, having been at the FT for 11 years, I'm interested in seeing how much of what I learned there applies elsewhere. So I'm working generally part-time with a number of different clients, looking at operations, incident management, engineering enablement, tech leadership, and really enjoying that breadth of information that I'm getting. And then I'm doing some I talk at various conferences and run workshops. It's really interesting and different to have that breadth of everything that I'm doing.
That's fantastic. Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.